Introduce our first plenary speaker today. We're very excited to have Lola Fatoyinbo, a research physical scientist in earth sciences remote sensing from NASA. And we're very excited to have her. She's in the Biospheric Sciences Lab at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, where she studies forest ecology and ecosystem structure using active remote sensing instruments. Lola received her doctorate in environmental sciences in 2008 with a focus on forest ecology of tropical wetlands. Then she went on to a NASA postdoctoral program at the Radar Science and Engineering section at the Jet Propulsion Lab, where she worked on interferometric radar data to quantify tropical forest extent, height, biomass through the development of radar lidar fusion algorithms. So she has been at NASA's Goddard Center since 2010. Her current research focuses on the fusion of optical, SAR, and LiDAR data to quantify forest structure, biomass, extent, and degradation. She's a PI on a number of projects and instruments and is a recipient of the Presidential Early Career Award in Science and Engineering for her efforts on merging scientific priorities with advanced technology. So with that, I'd like to welcome Lola and really appreciate her coming this distance to speak to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me here. All right, there you go. So today I'll be talking about gradients in mangrove forest structure and their relationship to climate, geomorphology, and human influence. Over here in the background image that you see, this is a terrestrial laser scan of one of the tallest mangrove forests in the world. I won't tell you yet where it is because that's kind of what my talk is about. But I thought that this was a really nice picture to show in the background. All right. So in the past few years, there's been really an increase of interest in mangrove forests, and especially because they've been shown to have a really high carbon stocks, and because of their role in potential climate change mitigation and adaptation. And so this has led to a number of really high impact papers looking at the effect that mangroves have on a global scale. And in fact, if you do a Google Scholar search and put in the words mangrove and global, you can see that over the past few years there's been a significant increase in the number of papers that have been published with those two keywords. So as I mentioned, a lot of these papers are really focused on looking at the global carbon stocks of mangroves, and a lot of them are based on modeling of carbon stocks, specifically using a latitudinal relationship. So what was really missing from this is trying to estimate kind of more directly what the carbon stocks are in mangroves or what the structure of mangroves are on a global scale. So when I mean structure, what I really mean is forest canopy height. So why do we even care about mangrove structure? First of all, it's a more direct indicator of above ground biomass and therefore of above ground carbon stocks. And it's also really important for many other applications, such as trying to estimate ecosystem condition. For example, if you're trying to see whether a forest is intact versus a more degraded forest, if you're interested in seeing what the different ecosystem services are that are provided by a mangrove, it could be helpful to know what their structure is, and also what the environmental drivers are that are leading to differences in structures in mangrove. For example, is this a system that is limited by nutrients or fresh water? And then also, if you're trying to do ecosystem restoration, it's really helpful to know what the structure of a forest is. So, the objectives of my work and also of my talk today are threefold. First, I'll be talking about drivers of global mangrove canopy height and biomass. And I'll also go a little bit into the drivers of losses of mangrove extent and also where the gains and losses are globally. And then finally, I'll focus in a little bit more locally, since this is a conference that is focused on the Florida Everglades. I'll talk a little bit more on our work on looking at the interaction of hurricanes and forest structure in the Everglades as a result of Hurricane Irma in 2017. So, as was mentioned in my bio, I do a lot of work with satellite data, especially with what's called synthetic aperture radar, or SAR, and LiDAR data. So I'm not going to go into too much of the details of these different techniques, but what I wanted to say is that these two techniques have been shown to work really well, especially in mangrove forests. And so we've been working on developing maps of mangrove forest structure for several years. And in fact, a lot of this work is based on an original study that started here in Florida, working in the Florida Everglades. This is Mark Simard's study from 2006, where he used data from the Shuttle Radar Topography Mission, which is an instrument that was flown on the Space Shuttle Endeavour in 2000 to measure the topography of the Earth. But in addition to measuring just the surface topography, it also measures the canopy height of a forest on top. And this works especially well in mangroves because they grow at sea level or there's no underlying topography. But to get an actual accurate measurement of what the height of the forest is, you also need another data set, either field data, or if you have access to it, you would use LiDAR data because that is the most accurate data that you have to estimate forest canopy height. So in this case, we combined the SRTM data with the ISAC GLASS data. This is a mission that was flying from 2000 to 2006. It was a free-flying satellite to develop a calibration to go from ISAC GLASS to what we call top of canopy height. And the result was, first, a map of the Florida Everglades, but now we've actually been able, thanks to increasing computing capacity and data availability, to produce it for the entire globe. So here you go. This was recently published with Mark Simard as first author back in January. So here's our map of global mangrove height. And from height, we also got biomass. And we didn't just do the map and not know where to, sorry, what I'm trying to say is we didn't just do the map and not carry out any field measurements. We actually also had field data from over 330 plots all around the world, most of them focused here in the Americas. We had some field data also in Mozambique and East Africa, and then we had 150 plots that were also collected in the Sundarbans of Bangladesh. And when we made this map, there were some areas where we weren't really sure of our measurements because they didn't seem to be right. We were finding some areas where there were mangrove tree heights that were over 50 meters tall, and in some areas even up to 60 meters tall, and we thought, this just doesn't make any sense. Who's ever seen a 60-meter tall mangrove in here? So we actually went to Gabon, which is one of the areas where we saw these really tall trees, and we measured them in the field, and we were right. These trees were actually individual trees that we found were over 65 meters tall. We had multiple people remeasure the same tree because we couldn't believe what we were seeing. So our findings are that maximum canopy height did range, and this is, right here we have 63 meters because this is at a 30-meter pixel. And we found that the tallest trees were in Gabon, here in Central Africa, and also in Colombia on the Pacific coast. Let's see. If you look at overall forest height distribution, this is what I'm showing down here on the left, we found that even though we had, in some areas, do find these tall trees, a majority of all mangrove forests are under 13 meters. So about 50% of all trees are under 14 meters in height, which is what you see in general when you're going out to a mangrove forest. But about 5% of all trees are over 40 meters tall. And so now that we had the global data available, we could look at per country statistics. And what we found is those countries that have the tallest trees actually aren't the countries that have also the highest carbon stocks. In fact, it's mostly the countries that have the largest area that will have the largest carbon stocks. So Indonesia dwarfs all other countries, actually making up about a quarter of all carbon stocks globally, followed by the other 5 countries with the largest area in mangroves. Here, I'm going to show you, as I said, we didn't believe previously that these trees were actually that tall, so when we went in the field, we also took a terrestrial laser scanner with us. So this is a fly-through of a terrestrial laser LiDAR scan in one of those really tall patches, and actually, what you're seeing here, these trees are about a meter and a half in diameter, and those top prop roots are about 6 meters off the ground. So these are huge trees, impossible to measure a DBH, and don't even try. But it was really, it's an amazing forest. Highly recommend going there if you ever get the chance. All right, so now that we have this global data set and we have this map, this allows us to ask some questions on what the different drivers are and what the different structures are around the world. So first thing we wanted to get from the height map is global above ground biomass. As I mentioned, we had field plots from 330, field data from 330 plots around the world. So the first question we asked is, what is the relationship between biomass and height globally? We didn't want to just develop a latitudinal model, and we also didn't want to have one model for all mangrove forests around the world, because our field data was actually showing us that there's a big difference in the different forests. So what you're seeing here is a relationship between field plot biomass and then canopy height measured. And what you see here is that the slope of the different relationships is very different. We broke this into different regions. So we have one for the Americas here in green, versus East Asia, Middle East, and then Southeast Asia. And what you're seeing here is that the slope of the Americas plot is very different from the plot for East Asia and East Africa. And this tells us essentially that the stocking density for these areas are very different. So even though you have the same canopy height, because you have more trees in East Africa and East Asia, you'll have a much higher biomass. We also wanted to know what is explaining the distribution of above ground height and biomass globally. First we thought, well, maybe it's tides. Maybe if you have a higher tidal influence, that'll allow you to have taller trees. So we took a model of global maximum tide and tidal range, and then we plotted against maximum canopy height, and there's absolutely no relationship. So we thought, okay, well, it's not tide. Okay, so then we thought, okay, is it latitude, is it cyclones, is it temperature? And we just threw in all of the different temperatures, minimum, maximum, number of cold days. And here's one of our results. So on here we plotted, you see here the maximum canopy height at 1 degree, every 1 degree. In the background, what you're seeing here is tropical cyclone relative frequency. So what we see is that if you're around the equator, your cyclone frequency is much lower. So this shows us very well that your maximum height is directly correlated with your latitude. But there's also seems to be a relationship between cyclone frequency and your maximum height. So then what we did is that we took those numbers, we threw them into a multivariate regression to try to see, we really looked at, we didn't look at tide anymore, but we looked at all the temperatures, we looked at annual precipitation, maximum precipitation, mean precipitation, and tropical cyclone landfall. And what we found is that we were actually right. It is the annual precipitation, mean annual temperature, and tropical cyclone landfall frequency that is the biggest predictor of your canopy height around the world. So then if we break it down into coast, this gives us an even better view of what we're talking about. Here, this is the Pacific coast of the Americas. We're seeing there's almost no cyclone frequency. You have very high total annual rainfall, and subsequently also mean low sea surface salinity in areas where you have really high tropical rainfall. And in background here in green, what we're showing is maximum canopy height. So here you have lots of rainfall, you have really tall trees. Same in the Atlantic coast of Africa, lots of rainfall, tall trees, and no cyclones. If you're looking here at the Indian Ocean area where you have a lot of tropical cyclones, tree height is much, much shorter. Okay, so all of this made sense, but then there was one area where you would think, okay, there's also low cyclone frequency and quite high precipitation, and this is in the Indian Ocean of Asia, but maximum canopy height is not that high. So what is leading to this? So this is where the effect of humans really comes into play. So one of the questions that we have now that we're working on is to look at the effect of human influence on not only canopy structure, but also biomass, and also looking at the areas where, trying to estimate where the losses and gains of forests are happening, mangrove forests are happening. Okay, so we've been working on generating a global map of mangrove losses and of mangrove gains, and also trying to estimate what the drivers of those losses are. This is work by Liza Goldberg and David Lagomasino, who is also here today. And this is a really impressive study where they were able to map every area of mangrove loss and to assign it to a driver of that loss. So in the first step, what we were able to do here is to map the loss and then to assign whether it was changed to wet soil, to open water, or to dry soil, because that gives us an indication of what type of loss it is. And then once we know whether it's wet soil, dry soil, or open water, we could then combine it with other ancillary data sets, such as global population density or agricultural areas, to see what the exact driver of each loss is. So here I'm showing you some examples. And in the end, we have 5 main drivers of mangrove loss that are erosion, that are dieback, natural or anthropogenic. There's aquaculture or agriculture, so commodities that are driving loss. And then there's also human sediment, so urbanization, for example. And depending on the type of loss that you see and the proximity to one of these drivers, we will then able to assign a type of loss to each pixel of mangrove loss. So here I'm showing an example in the Sundarbans of Bangladesh, where actually most of the loss is due to what we're calling erosion. In this case, this could be sea level rise, or it could be changes in water currents. So here's our final result. Here I'm showing losses of mangroves from 2000 to 2050, this is just 2000 to 2016, and what the main driver of loss is. So as you see in West Africa, for example, the main driver is primarily human-driven, and same in Southeast Asia. So this is due to commodities such as agriculture and aquaculture. In the Americas, the main driver is mostly natural. So in this case, that would be cyclones or hurricanes. And down here is a little video example of 15-year losses in mangroves that were converted to aquaculture. Can we run this video again? And you'll see that every 5 years, so this is, oh, no, the previous one. There, here, is it working? There you go. All right, so this is every 5 years, every 5-year epoch change or loss in mangrove cover. And in green, this is conversion to aquaculture, and yellow is conversion to agriculture. And this is actually in a protected area in Sulawesi in Indonesia. All right, so now I'm going to focus a little bit more on this more natural driver of mangrove loss and kind of zoom in on our area of here, South Florida and the Caribbean. Let me see. Go back one. I was trying to show, there you go. This is a video made by NASA's Global Modeling and Assimilation Office showing the really intense hurricane season from 2017. And as we know, in 2017, Harvey, Irma, and Maria all made landfall in the US and resulted in catastrophic damage, not only to human infrastructure, but also to coastal ecosystems such as mangroves. And as it turned out, in April of 2017, we had a pretty extensive airborne campaign here in South Florida with one of our instruments called GEER, where we flew very large areas of LiDAR data over the Florida Everglades, trying to look at the effect of previous hurricanes on mangrove resilience. So, all right. So these are the flight lines that we flew in April of 2017. We covered a really large area here in South Florida, and we're looking at the effect of hurricane impacts on saltwater intrusion and also peat collapse. So here I'm showing a picture of an area, I think this is near Cape Sable, where there was mangrove damage from 2005 that has not recovered since then. Well, then as it turned out, Hurricane Irma went right through and actually had a huge influence here on mangrove forests in the Everglades. So this was an opportunity for us to go and refly and try to see what the effect of the hurricane was on the forest structure. Okay, so we flew not only over South Florida, but also over Puerto Rico, and both sites were really hit very bad by Irma and Maria. And here are some examples of what the data looks like. The GLIDE instrument has a LiDAR, a hyperspectral camera, and also a really high resolution camera on it. So on the top here, what you're seeing is a normalized difference vegetation index image from March 2017 and then December 2017. Essentially what just shows you is the greenness or productivity of a forest, and as you see it goes down significantly from these two time frames. And here once again you're seeing all the leaves and then total defoliation in some areas afterwards. As we know, Irma caused defoliation, tree snapping, and lots of uprooting. So in addition to having the airborne campaign, we also carried out extensive field campaigns so that we would have field validation of some of the measurements that we took. And one of the goals was also to try to see whether we can actually estimate or measure the different types of losses that are a consequence of hurricane impact. All right. So here I'm just going to show you some of the really amazing data that was collected from GLIDE. Here we have a high resolution camera photo of the Shark River area. And then I'm going to zoom in here just to highlight how high resolution this is. You can actually see individual trees in the pre and post data here. And this is all online on the GLIDE website and available for analysis. All right. So in total, GLIDE collected data over 130,000 hectares of coastal wetlands. And so our analysis is showing here when we're this is the canopy height model of from April 2017, and then we have a canopy height model from November 2017. And what we see is that there's a over 20% change of volume in terms of foliage, branches, and stems. And then if we look here, this is the amount of gaps from April to November 2017. We also see a really significant increase in the number of gaps. And in fact, we found that snap branches or uprooted trees covered over 40% of the total area. So one of the main questions that we wanted to answer is, how resilient are these forests and what is causing the main loss in mangrove forests here in southern Florida after the hurricanes? So we combined several of our data sets to try to estimate what the resilience and the recovery time was of each forest. So what I'm showing here is a storm surge, modeled storm surge. During Irma, we have maximum wind speed that is also modeled. Then here we have canopy height loss. This is a combination of the airborne data and satellite data sets. We have fractional vegetation cover loss. This is in the 3 months after the hurricane. And then we have total recovery time. And this is recovery time not just from Hurricane Irma, but also from all previous hurricanes. So what we're seeing here is that these areas, as I showed before, are not really recovering. They're taking over 5 years to recover, whereas some other areas are much more resilient and recovering quite quickly. So one of the questions we have is, how come some of these areas are much more resilient than others, and what is leading them to recover more quickly? And what we saw is that the difference between low resilience and high resilience areas is really a difference of geomorphology, and it really is a difference of how much flushing there is in these areas. So if you have an area that is impacted, like here, you see this area that is impacted by a road, and and you have storm surge coming into this basin, and there's no area for the water to drain from here. This is leading to hypoxia, and then it leads to eutrophication. And a year after the hurricane, this area has still not recovered and is actually dying. Whereas if you have an area like this is closer to the Shark River, it's connected to a river, so there is constant draining of the water. This area might be taller, you might have many more trees that are uprooted and snapped, but because you have much more drainage here and freshwater input, you're seeing much faster recovery in this area after a year. And then if we zoom in again on in this region, and look at the different areas that have low resilience versus high resilience. So low is in red and high is in blue and green. If you look at the soil elevation in these areas, these are really small differences in soil elevation, but they're really important. So what we see here is that the areas that have low resilience are actually much lower, have a much lower elevation, whereas areas that have a higher resilience are, well, just a little bit higher. And so that allows them to have more drainage, and that allows them to then recover much better. Okay. So as I mentioned before, this was not just a really intense hurricane season just for Florida, but it's actually happened all over the Mesoamerica and Caribbean. So a study that we're working on right now is looking at the effect of cyclones, or looking at the effect of hurricanes in all of the Caribbean and Mesoamerica, and also looking at the time series of hurricanes that have happened over the past few years. So here we're looking at different storm intensities over time. Here what I'm showing is the total area that was impacted by tropical storms since 2009. And what you'll see is that, even though it varies significantly here, there's if you look at the amount of mangrove damage due to tropical storms, it doesn't really vary. So even if you have lots of tropical storms, they don't really affect mangrove forests that strongly. But if you have increased area of hurricane damage, so higher winds and higher storm surge, this is what's really killing the mangroves down here. And then once again, if you look, and this is just looking at aerial damage for 1 year, if you even look at the impact over time, this is also what's causing the increased, profound effects of loss. So this is loss even after multiple years. Okay. All right. So in summary, we've shown that mangrove structure varies greatly globally, and we found that mangroves attain 60+ meters over time. And if we look at a global scale, latitude, temperature, and rainfall are shown to be the main predictors of maximum height, followed by tropical cyclone frequency. We also showed that human influences of land use and land cover changes, and in fact, even human influences through climate change, such as sea level rise and potentially increasing extreme event frequency, are also really influencing mangrove structure, biomass, and carbon stocks globally. And then when we focus on Florida and the Caribbean, we've seen that the intense 2017 hurricane season resulted in much higher mangrove losses than tropical storms in previous years. And with that, I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank all of my collaborators and co-investigators who've really helped with a lot of this work. And a special thanks to the Florida Coastal LTER, which was really spearheaded almost all of the work that I've shown today. It was actually the first mangrove forest that I ever went to, so thank you.
So if you are interested in asking a question, please step up to one of the floor mics. We've got a few minutes to entertain a couple. I'd like to start with one while maybe some folks are coming up. It was excellent presentation. We have a number of people that work obviously in the mangrove ecosystems in South Florida and resource managers here. Given what you've seen from these data, looking at them globally, are there any one or two major recommendations that you would make to managers in terms of what we should be doing to really increase the resilience and recovery of mangrove systems?
I think one of the take-home messages that I was trying to show is that really it's the hydrology of the system that is the most important when you're trying to have a healthy mangrove forest. So I think if you're trying to do a restoration project, we're seeing all around the world there's lots of efforts for planting, for example, but they're not always planting, and they're sometimes not really thinking about what the system was like naturally, or where to do or looking at the hydrology. So, and I think that this is something that, from my understanding, that's being done really well here in Florida.
Yeah, I'd be interested in that, talking more about that too. Go ahead. Why don't you identify yourself when you ask your question? So
thank you for being here and presenting this information. I think it's really useful for mangrove ecology to have a better understanding of our structure, particularly on larger scales when you can't get out and physically survey all these areas. I'm interested to know if the technology, though, if we can if you're able to look for signatures of mangrove stress. So I know you presented on hurricanes in which there's almost an immediate impact and change in that structure. But I'm more interested in understanding if there's a way to take that technology and look backwards on sites that we know have maybe collapsed due to a different anthropogenic effect, such as a mosquito ditching or a road that got put in and cut off that hydrology, right? And that change in structure takes years, maybe even decades before you see a complete collapse of that. So I'm curious to know if there's a way to pick up on a signature of a mangrove forest that is in stress, and that may help to prioritize where restoration efforts are needed prior to that collapse. Because once it's a collapsed system, it's really difficult to return back to a healthy mangrove system.
Yeah, so that's a really important question. So essentially what you're asking for in some type is if we can measure not just complete loss, but also degradation of a system kind of prior to loss. And so that's something that we are working on. We can do it historically by using, now we have a Landsat data set that goes from the 1980s to today. So that might allow us to do some analysis looking at the whole time series and trying to see if there are areas that are stressed prior to them, as you say, completely collapsing. So that is something that we're working on now, and then hopefully in a few years, NASA is planning a new mission. Right now it's called Surface Biology and Geology. I hope they changed the name. It used to be called HISPRI, and that would be a hyperspectral instrument, and that would give us a better idea of what the different species are, so we could do species differentiation, or at least functional types, and then also give us an idea of areas that are stressed. The G-Light data also has a hyperspectral camera, and so there is a possibility of trying to see whether there's some data over areas that that are stressed, and to see whether that can be used to map that.
Thank you.
Peter?
Peter Frederick with the University of Florida. I don't study mangroves, I study birds. But I was really interested in the presentation because it was very high quality. You mentioned temperature. We're at the sort of northern limit of mangroves here. I was wondering if you saw any signature of increased mangrove growth as the climate warms that might offset some of the losses that you detected from other regions.
So that is a very good question. There have been studies done, especially here in Florida, and I think also in Mexico and in Australia, looking at how increased temperatures are leading to an increased transition, essentially, of mangroves further north. And so I think that is clearly happening. Will they be able to offset all the losses? Probably not. What we're actually seeing is that, and I didn't really talk about it today, but we also have a map of mangrove gains. And we've been looking at all of the gains that are happening globally. And actually, there's quite a few areas of natural gains happening around the world, primarily in delta areas. And we're still trying to figure out how much they were able to offset. David recently published a paper looking at 4 deltas around the world where he found that if you look at the total carbon stocks of the new forest that was naturally regenerated versus the areas that are lost, they're actually able to offset quite a large portion of it, but I don't think that they'll be able to offset all of it.
Thank you.
Thank you. We got time for one more question, Andy?
All right, real quick one. I love mangroves. I also like a lot of other habitats. The combination of hyperspectral LiDAR and thermal imaging, can it be applied to other important habitat types?
Yeah, absolutely. It also works. What I was showing here works particularly well in mangroves because, like what I said, they grow at sea level or there's no underlying topography, so we have a lot less error in our measurements. But it can also be applied to other coastal or non-coastal ecosystems.
I've got one more very quick question. I can't resist. The 3D image, you showed the laser image of the canopy. What kind of instruments used to do that?
Oh, sure. It's a terrestrial laser scanner. So it's like it's used in construction as well and in architecture very much. So it's a LiDAR instrument that's on a tripod, and you put it in the forest, and then it turns and it shoots billions of lasers, and then it measures the return time. And it's actually, I think, millimeter resolution.
And you had to, how many different locations to get that one image did you have to?
I'm not sure. I think maybe 5.
That's fascinating. I love gadgets, and that's a really cool one.
It's great. It's a really cool one. It's really hard to take into a mangrove, especially when the prop roots are tall. So I'm giving kudos to Atticus, my postdoc, who did that, because it's heavy instrument. It's a heavy instrument. And it's lots of climbing, as everyone who works in mangroves knows. So.
And especially, that was in Gabon? I can't remember. What other critters are you watching for while you're in there taking those images?
Actually, there weren't that. It was pretty good. It wasn't that bad. Actually, to be honest, the scariest mangrove I've ever been in is the Florida Everglades. Never seen as many mosquitoes in my life. So.
All right, well,
only
thank
goes
you
up
very
from there.
much. Really appreciate it.